Well then, working with Homer, the title of this panel, is especially appropriate for an exploration of the way the Odyssey's primary narrator Homer and its secondary narrator Odysseus join hands in presenting a narrative and adding to one another's story, thus combining individual traditions. It is well known, of course, that Homer the poet lavishly gives the floor to his speaking characters. In the Iliad, an epic poem that I attribute to Homer and the authorship of which I will not further discuss today, roughly half of the lines is direct speech. With Homer as the primary and omniscient narrator, speaking characters may be referred to as secondary narrators. As a rule of thumb, secondary narrators only speak of what Homer allows them to know and talk about. Secondary narrators are thus dependent on the primary narrator, the poet Homer, for the content of their thoughts and words and for their stage time. In general, the account of events by secondary narrators is not considered essentially different from that of the primary narrator. Homer is presented as the sole editor of the authoritative version of the tale, centering around the wrath of Achilles and the homecoming of Odysseus. In performance, rhapsodes strive to reenact the primary poet's authorship through evoking the occasion of the construction of the narrative before a live audience. There is no doubt, though, in whose legendary hands control of the storyline ultimately rests, not even when rhapsodic performance implies, as Nagy has extensively argued, the taking over of the narrative by one rhapsode from another. With the narrative thread of the Iliad and the Odyssey assigned to Homer, some of the embedded well-known stories within the story, para-narratives, as Eldon has labeled them, attract attention for their length and the level of detachment from the main storyline and format. Embedded stories do have a function in the wider narrative, of course, but their embedding and wording seems to betray their origin as an insertion into the main narrative of relatively freestanding episodes, as has been extensively argued elsewhere. The suggestion presents itself of a smaller scale narrative, possibly an epyllion, that is somehow integrated in a larger whole as embedded and direct speech. As participant in the embassy to Achilles in Iliad Book 9, Phoenix, for example, recounts the story of Meleager as a warning to Achilles. His point, as has been stated earlier in that same passage, is that Achilles should let go of the anger that keeps him from the battlefield as a warrior and accept the compensation offered him in return for Agamemnon's claim to Briseis and Achilles' subsequent loss of face through his inability to undo the insult in front of the entire Greek army. Phoenix understands Achilles' wrath and his refusal to fight until now, but he emphasizes that Agamemnon's offer of compensation, the brothers-in-arms' effort to convince him, and Phoenix's own lifelong parenthood of Achilles should reasonably motivate the hero to put his negative emotions aside. Other heroes, he claims, did so in the past, and even the gods can be appeased by prayers. Men then equally susceptible to sin and mistake should the more bend upon the call of the Letae, the prayers, daughters of Zeus, since neglecting them will evoke ate, the risk that the hero calls disaster upon himself and others and must be blamed for it. Phoenix's introduction to his warning story works like a proem. It sets the interpretive scene for the story to come and explicitly announces its theme. It also summarizes what will feature in the story, much like the very short and selective summaries in the poems of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Subsequently, the performer Phoenix identifies himself in relation to what will be told and identifies his audience. Compare Odyssey, line 10. Tell us too. The story itself starts out as a once upon a time. The Curetes and the Aetoloi fought and killed in imperfect tense, and against this background, Artemis in Aorist stirred an evil as she was forgotten in sacrifice. The pattern sounds familiar enough. For 70 lines, Phoenix, as the secondary narrator, takes over from Homer, only to finish his epyllion by returning to his addressee with an emphatic su, and the encouragement to accept compensation before being forced to intervene without any. Many other embedded stories appear in the Iliad and the Odyssey, regularly with comparable intros. Think of the story of Odysseus' actions at Troy, told by Helen and Menelaus in the 4th book of the Odyssey, and Menelaus' extensive account of his and Helen's misadventures. Let me see if I have it here. I have it here. All these embedded stories are introduced similarly and all have clear sources. Helen claims to have encountered Odysseus during his reconnaissance mission in Troy. Menelaus recounts Odysseus' cold-bloodedness inside the wooden horse, with himself inside the trap too, and Helen as a witness outside. Helen and Menelaus are witnesses again for the extensive story he relates concerning Proteus. Another well-known embedded story equally features the characteristics of the epyllian proem, but remains without a named source, since witnesses can only be immortal. The affair of Ares and Aphrodite in Odyssey Book 8. The introduction to the story features an indication of the main characters and the main theme and a clear point of commencement. The story is concluded with the listing of Aphrodite's sacred place, her attendants, and her garments, in other words, like a Homeric hymn. By contrast, the Phaeacian singer presents an example of the opposite by his enigmatic but traditional intro about the quarrel between Achilles and Odysseus, but without subsequently presenting the story itself. Three key features of embedded stories that suggest an origin in freestanding narratives are their length, suggestive of a diminishing role for the primary narrator the longer the story continues, their self-contained shape and content, and their appropriation by the secondary narrators, who commonly are keen to emphasize either their own involvement or their source. A remarkable narrator, and one that appropriates many of the embedded epyllia in the Odyssey, is its eponymous hero. Odysseus tells a number of stories, many of them instrumental to the Odyssey's plot. His famous Cretan lying tales, for example, geared at individuals for whom his true identity needs to remain hidden, notably Eumaeus and Penelope, incorporate entire freestanding episodes in a mixture of truths and falsehoods, as the primary narrator explicitly tells us, the external audience. As a secondary narrator, Odysseus gets and grabs the chance to practically replace the primary narrators in the books 9 to 12 of the Odyssey, the so-called apologoi. This extensive narrative is merely one in a series, all performed at the occasion of a feast where Odysseus is entertained by the Phaeacian king and his entourage. Odysseus initially replaces and outdoes the Phaeacian bard Demodocus, who presents his stories during the dinner party, which the king hosts in honor of the anonymous guest. The above-mentioned tales of the quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles, of the love of Ares and Aphrodite, are all to some extent taken from the hands of the Phaeacian singer and presented as independent episodes. Odysseus' contribution is upon request. Alcinous has seen that his unknown guest reacted emotionally to tales concerning Troy, and he wonders whether the stranger's background is somehow related to those rumored events. Odysseus complies, staging a few elements of his tale by way of introduction, and acknowledging his audience and the source of his performance, his hypocrisis. By then, he has already introduced himself with a direct reference to rumor. His has already reached the sky. Odysseus' positioning as a narrator is remarkable in more than one sense. First, he identifies as the main character of Demodocus' first epyllion on the quarrel and his last on the sack of Troy. He thereby appropriates every rumor, kleidos, apparently already divulged concerning the hero of the wooden horse. No wonder he claims that the rumor of Odysseus' deeds, by now his own, reaches heaven. Odysseus' appropriation of the hero's main role in the ensuing narrative is an instinctive and ingenious response to the sudden realization and surprise that Odysseus is already 10 years after the sack of Troy, a famed character, known, as he claims himself, for his trickery. Whereas the external audience has been informed several times that much of Odysseus' actions before Troy, and even much of his whereabouts over the past 10 years, has become well known by now, for example, through the alleged prediction by Hypocrisis in the second book. The confrontation with Phaeacian Demodocus is the first time Odysseus himself realizes that his is the stuff of stories, kleia andron, in the true sense. Odysseus' storytelling is thus creating a performance out of rumored deeds and characters, or, as puts it, creating his own kleos. Burgess points out that many elements in Odysseus' apology are references to other stories that are presented as well known to the internal and possibly also the external audience, like the mention of the ship the Argo, dear to all, so that Odysseus' travel appears belated, a conscious recreation of accounts that have been anticipated by others and that are known to both the Odyssey's internal and external audience. Athena's confirmation in Odyssey 13 of both her foreknowledge and the necessity for humans to strive for kleos in order to attain any, nicely summarizes how apparently external performance and reception of the Odyssey has infiltrated Odysseus' internally embedded apology. I argue, however, that there is more going on in Odysseus' appropriation of well-known story elements, and especially in his positioning as a narrator. From the start of his autobiography, Odysseus is careful to imitate the storytelling techniques that the primary narrator deploys throughout the Odyssey. One he uses remarkably often is the notion of foreknowledge. The Cyclops knew he would encounter an Odysseus who would mutilate him. Circe knew Odysseus would resist her magic spells, as she knew about the nostoi of other Greeks and what awaited Odysseus on his journey home. Tiresias' Eidolon predicts both the return voyage and the challenges on Ithaca and even beyond. Odysseus is also careful in naming his sources. He gets his information, so he claims, from Circe, Calypso, Tiresias, the Sirens. Famous is his afterthought, explaining how he got to know what Zeus and Helios decided with regard to the disobedient comrades on Trinacria. Apparently, Circe informed him. Odysseus himself is an informant too. Allegedly, he discussed the events around Troy and the return journeys of the Greek hero for a month with Aeolus. But the temporal paradox between the Odyssey's reception and Odysseus within the epic is not the only one in my view. The second paradox appears on the editorial level. In presenting himself as the main character of the first and the last of Demodocus' songs, Odysseus claims status as an editor. He alone can decide on authorship and verisimilitude of the songs he sings. And he sings for a very long time, for 4 books, almost 2,200 lines. Odysseus replaces Homer as the primary narrator. He tells a story with various stories within the story, each single one backed up with his own authority, and not a single other witness. He turns his own rumors into hypocrisis of kleia. The adventurous episodes he tells to amuse the Phaeacians and encourage them to present him with gifts and a safe return to Ithaca are carefully tailored to the internal audience. Both the start of his journey home, leaving the destroyed city of Troy, and his final port of call before arriving at Scheria, Calypso's island, are well known to his hosts. Most of the episodes he recounts, however, are, to use the words of de Jong in her narratological commentary, not authenticated. That is, the episodes are not mentioned by the primary narrator Homer before Odysseus mentions them. Of course, the Cyclops, Calypso, Circe, and the sun god's cattle are duly authenticated well before Odysseus mentions any of them to the Phaeacians. Some are mentioned by Zeus or Athena. Others appear to be all too familiar to the Phaeacians. Their queen Arete knows Circe, and only 2 generations ago the Phaeacians used to tolerate Cyclopes as their neighbors. All other episodes, Lotus Eaters, Aiolos, Lastrygonians, Netherworld, Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis, seem to be new for the internal audience as well as for the poet Homer. He mentions them as a narrator only after Odysseus has completed his autobiography and summarizes them, for example, in his rendering of Odysseus and Penelope's pillow talk in Book 23. So much for the primary narrator's control over the secondary narrator's thoughts and actions. So much as well for Homer's unique editorship. For the duration of the apology, Odysseus invents and decides on most of the content, to the amazement of all his audiences and his editor. Only after he has finished may Homer join in on the full content of the autobiography and apply it in his own editing. As replacement primary narrator, Odysseus expounds on Demodocus' songs, telling the story of the suffering and wandering of a man that he now claims to be himself. Like Demodocus, Odysseus resorts to embedded indirect discourse, an epyllion that remains relatively independent in a larger whole, but is furnished with an identifiable persona and deliberately giving the outlook of the Cleia Andron editions, the rumors concerning individuals to be remembered by posterity as the glorious deeds of man. In doing so, Odysseus turns himself into an editor, collaborating with the Odyssey's primary narrator. His appropriation of tales told by others reflects the way in which Homeric epyllia were assigned to the poet who claims them and brought in line with the aesthetic and style of the larger whole. Together, the secondary narrator Odysseus and the poem's primary narrator, commonly referred to as Homer, built a narrative that presents the events of the past as eventualities that are only mildly relevant for the story internal here and now. In conclusion, I propose to approach this distributed editorship as an attempt to accelerate the development of the epic genre, much like Shubha Pathak draws upon the rapid transformation of rumor into Cleia Andron as an instance of self-affirmation. Thank you.